The snow fell silently across the Ardennes forest on the morning of December 15th, 1944, blanketing the dense woodlands in a deceptive peace that would be shattered within hours. Lieutenant Colonel Joachim Piper adjusted his field glasses and surveyed the American positions through the morning mist, his breath forming small clouds in the frigid air. Behind him, the engines of King Tiger tanks rumbled to life, their massive forms emerging from camouflaged positions, like prehistoric beasts awakening from slumber. The Allied forces had grown complacent in what they called the Ghost Front, an 85-mile stretch of thinly defended line, where green American troops were sent to gain experience in what military commanders believed was a quiet sector. The 4th Infantry Division and the newly arrived 106th Infantry Division held positions that would soon become the epicenter of Adolf Hitler's last desperate gamble to turn the tide of the war in Western Europe. General Dwight Eisenhower had recently moved his headquarters to Versailles, confident that the German Wehrmacht was spent after the costly battles of Normandy and the retreat across France. Intelligence reports suggested that German forces were in full retreat, their reserves depleted and morale shattered. The Supreme Allied commander could not have been more wrong about the storm gathering in the forests of the Eifel region, according to historical accounts documented in the National Archives and Records Administration. The American intelligence failure preceding the Battle of the Bulge remains one of the most significant oversights in military history. Hitler had been planning this offensive since September, code-naming it Operation Watch on the Rhine Operation. Whacked AM Rhine, the Führer envisioned a massive breakthrough that would split the Allied armies, capture the vital port of Antwerp, and potentially force the Western Allies to negotiate a separate peace. 3 entire German armies, the 6th Panzer Army under Sepp Dietrich, the 5th Panzer Army commanded by Hasso von Manteuffel, and the 7th Army led by Erich Brandenberger, had been secretly assembled for this final throw of the dice. The German buildup had been masterful in its deception. Units moved only at night. Radio silence was maintained, and even hospital patients were pressed back into service to fill the ranks. Over 200,000 German soldiers, supported by nearly 600 tanks and assault guns, waited in the darkness of the Ardennes forest. The irony was palpable. The same terrain through which German forces had achieved their stunning victory in 1940 was about to witness Hitler's final bid for salvation. Private First Class James Henderson of the 28th Infantry Division stamped his feet to ward off the cold as he peered into the fog-shrouded forest. At 19 years old, the farm boy from Iowa had arrived in Europe only weeks earlier, replacing casualties from the autumn fighting. He clutched his M1 Garand rifle with numb fingers, unaware that he stood on the threshold of the largest battle American forces would fight in the European theater. Behind him, his foxhole partner slept fitfully, wrapped in a thin blanket that provided little protection against the bitter December cold. As dawn approached on December 16th, the forest seemed to hold its breath, as if nature itself sensed the approaching tempest that would transform this quiet sector into a frozen hell, and ultimately become known to history as the Battle of the Bulge. At precisely 5:30 in the morning on December 16th, 1944, the silence of the Ardennes forest exploded into chaos. The largest artillery barrage on the Western Front since D-Day erupted along the American lines, as 1,600 German guns opened fire simultaneously. The earth trembled under the tremendous bombardment as shells screamed overhead, their deadly cargo transforming a peaceful winter landscape into a hellscape of splintered trees, frozen mud, and terror. Private Henderson jerked awake as the first shells impacted around his position, the concussion waves throwing him against the side of his foxhole. The carefully constructed American defensive positions, built more for comfort than combat effectiveness, began to disintegrate under the relentless pounding. Communication lines, strung haphazardly through the trees, were severed within minutes, leaving isolated units cut off from higher command and each other. The German artillery preparation lasted 90 minutes, systematically targeting command, posts, communication centers, and artillery positions. When the guns finally fell silent, an eerie quiet descended upon the smoking ruins of what had been peaceful American positions. Then, through the morning mist and drifting smoke, came the sound that would haunt survivors for the rest of their lives. The deep rumbling of tank engines, and the rhythmic crunch of thousands of boots advancing through the snow over her. Joachim Piper's 1st Panzer Regiment spearheaded the main effort of the 6th Panzer Army, their massive King Tiger and Panther tanks crushing through the forest undergrowth like mechanical dinosaurs. Behind them came waves of Waffen-SS infantry, their white winter camouflage making them nearly invisible against the snow-covered landscape. The German battle cry "Heil Hitler" echoed through the trees as stormtroopers emerged from the fog like ghosts, their machine guns chattering death. The initial American response was confusion and panic. Many units, caught completely off guard, simply disintegrated under the fierce German assault. The 106th Infantry Division, which had arrived in the sector only days earlier, found itself facing veteran German units with overwhelming superiority in numbers and firepower. Green American soldiers, many seeing combat for the first time, struggled to comprehend the magnitude of the disaster unfolding around them. However, not all American units collapsed. At key strong points throughout the Ardennes, small groups of determined soldiers began to organize desperate defensive actions. In the village of Lanzereth, an intelligence and reconnaissance platoon of just 18 men held up an entire German regiment for nearly 24 hours, disrupting the carefully planned German timetable from the very beginning. Military historians, as documented in Charles MacDonald's comprehensive work A Time for Trumpets, have noted that these small unit actions during the first day proved crucial in preventing German forces from achieving their ambitious objectives. Colonel Hurley Fuller's 110th Infantry Regiment found itself completely surrounded near the village of Clairvaux, but refused to surrender despite hopeless odds. These isolated pockets of resistance, scattered throughout the breakthrough zone, began to slow the German advance in ways that Wehrmacht planners had not anticipated. Every hour of delay was precious, allowing American reinforcements to begin moving toward the threatened sector. As night fell on December 16th, the scope of the German breakthrough became apparent to Allied commanders. Entire American divisions had been shattered or surrounded, leaving gaping holes in the western front through which German armored spearheads poured like water. Through a broken dam, the peaceful Ghost Front had become a nightmare of epic proportions, and the fate of the entire Allied campaign in Northwest Europe hung in the balance. As German forces raced toward their ultimate objective, the port city of Antwerp. The second day of the German offensive, December 17, 1944, dawned gray and bitter across the Ardennes battlefield. Oberfuhrer Piper's armored spearhead had penetrated nearly 20 miles into American lines, racing westward along narrow forest roads with the fury of men who knew this was their last chance for victory. Behind them lay a trail of burning American vehicles and the scattered remnants of units that had tried unsuccessfully to stem the German tide. Battery B of the 285th Field Artillery Observation Battalion was retreating westward when fate placed them directly in the path of Piper's advancing column. Near the crossroads village of Bonnies, just south of Malmedy, the American convoy, consisting of 30 vehicles carrying approximately 140 men, had no idea they were driving into the spearhead of the most elite Waffen-SS unit on the Western Front. The encounter was swift and devastating. Piper's lead tanks, massive King Tigers that dwarfed the American jeeps and trucks, appeared through the morning mist like mechanical monsters. The American vehicles, caught on an open road with no possibility of escape, were systematically destroyed by tank fire and Panzerfaust. Within minutes, the entire convoy was burning wreckage scattered across the frozen ground. The surviving Americans, approximately 84 men, were herded into a snow-covered field adjacent to the Café Badaro. Among them was Private First Class Homer Ford, a 20-year-old medic from Tennessee who would later become one of the few witnesses to survive what followed. The American prisoners were ordered to stand in ranks, while their German captors discussed their fate in rapid, harsh German that few of the Americans could understand. What happened next would become one of the most notorious war crimes committed on the Western Front. Without warning, SS Sturmbannführer Werner Petschke ordered his men to open fire on the defenseless prisoners. Machine guns chattered death as American soldiers fell into the snow, their blood staining the pristine white field crimson. Those who survived the initial volley were systematically executed by German soldiers who walked among the bodies, delivering coup de grace shots to anyone showing signs of life. The Malmedy Massacre, as documented in extensive war crimes trials conducted after the conflict, remains one of the most thoroughly investigated atrocities of World War II, with survivor testimonies providing crucial evidence of the systematic execution. Private Ford survived by falling beneath the body of a sergeant and remaining motionless for over 3 hours, until the German column had passed. When he finally crawled from beneath the corpses, he discovered that he was one of only approximately 20 men who had escaped death. through various means, playing dead, crawling away during the confusion, or hiding in nearby buildings. The massacre had far-reaching consequences beyond the immediate tragedy. Word of the atrocity spread rapidly through American lines, carried by the few survivors who managed to reach friendly forces. The news of German soldiers executing American prisoners in cold blood galvanized Allied resistance and eliminated any possibility of surrender, even in hopeless situations. American units that might otherwise have capitulated when surrounded chose instead to fight to the death rather than risk capture by SS forces. The psychological impact on German forces was equally significant. Piper's brutal efficiency had gained him perhaps 2 hours on his timetable, but it also ensured that American forces would show no mercy to his men. When the tide inevitably turned, the massacre at Malmedy had transformed what might have been a conventional military operation into a blood feud that would color every subsequent engagement in the battle. As December 17th drew to a close, Piper's spearhead continued its desperate race toward the Meuse River, leaving behind a trail of destruction and death that would echo through history. The quiet crossroads near Malmedy had become synonymous with one of the darkest chapters in the Battle of the Bulge, a reminder that even in the 20th century, the veneer of civilized warfare could be stripped away in moments of desperation. At fanaticism. December 18, 1944, found the strategic crossroads town of Bastogne transformed from a sleepy Belgian market center into the most crucial piece of real estate on the Western Front. 7 roads converged on this modest community of 4,000 inhabitants, making it the key to German hopes of reaching the Meuse River and ultimately Antwerp. As dawn broke over the snow-covered Ardennes, both sides recognized that the battle for Bastogne would determine the fate of Hitler's last great gamble. Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, acting commander of the 101st Airborne Division, surveyed the defensive preparations from his command post in the Heinz barracks. The Screaming Eagles had been rushed to Bastogne from their rest positions near Reims, arriving just hours before German forces completed their encirclement of the town. McAuliffe, a tough artilleryman from Washington, D.C., knew that his paratroopers faced overwhelming odds. Nearly 40,000 German troops, supported by hundreds of tanks, were closing the noose around his 8,000 defenders. The German forces surrounding Bastogne represented the cream of the Wehrmacht's remaining strength. General Heinrich Freiherr von Luttwitz's 47th Panzer Corps included the elite 2nd Panzer Division, the 26th Volksgrenadier Division, and the fearsome Panzer Lehr Division commanded by Fritz Bayerlein. These were veteran units that had fought across Europe, their ranks filled with soldiers who understood that Bastogne represented Germany's last hope for victory in the West. Inside the shrinking perimeter, American defenders prepared for what they knew would be a fight to the death. The paratroopers of the 501st Parachute Infantry Regiment dug foxholes in the frozen ground around the village of Foy, their breath forming clouds in the bitter cold. As they checked weapons and ammunition, many of these men had jumped into Normandy on D-Day and fought through the hedgerows of France. They were arguably the finest infantry in the American army, and they would need every ounce of their skill and courage in the coming days. The first German probing attacks began on the afternoon of December 18th, as Volksgrenadier Infantry tested the American perimeter with small unit actions designed to identify weak points in the defense. These initial encounters quickly escalated into fierce firefights as German forces discovered that the Americans had no intention of yielding ground easily. The crack of rifle fire and the chatter of machine guns echoed across the snow-covered fields surrounding Bastogne as both sides settled in for what promised to be a prolonged siege. Historical records maintained by the Army Historical Foundation detail how the defenders of Bastogne faced not only overwhelming enemy forces, but also critical shortages of ammunition, medical supplies, and winter clothing during the siege. The situation became increasingly desperate as German forces tightened their grip around the town. Artillery shells began falling randomly throughout Bastogne, sending civilians and soldiers alike scurrying for shelter in cellars and basements. The town's medieval architecture, with its thick stone walls and deep foundations, provided some protection from the bombardment, but nowhere was truly safe from the German guns that ringed. The perimeter. Supply became a critical issue as the siege entered its second day. The paratroopers had arrived in Bastogne with only the ammunition and equipment they could carry, expecting to be resupplied within hours. Instead, they found themselves completely cut off. With German forces controlling every road leading into the town, medical supplies ran dangerously low as casualties mounted. and the lack of winter clothing began to take its toll on men forced to remain in frozen foxholes for days at a time. Despite these hardships, morale among the defenders remained remarkably high. The paratroopers took pride in their elite status and had complete confidence in their officers and their ability to hold their positions against any enemy attack. They had volunteered for hazardous duty when they joined the airborne forces, and the siege of Bastogne represented exactly the kind of desperate situation for which they had trained. As December 18th ended with German forces in complete control of the roads around Bastogne, both sides prepared for the decisive battles that would determine whether this small Belgian town would become an American Thermopylae or a stepping stone to German victory. December 22nd, 1944. Dawn clear and bitterly cold over the besieged town of Bastogne. The fourth day of the siege had brought the defenders to the brink of collapse. Ammunition was critically low, medical supplies were exhausted, and the wounded lay in overcrowded cellars without proper care. German artillery had reduced much of the town center to rubble, and the perimeter had been compressed to barely 5 miles in circumference. It was at this moment of maximum crisis that General Heinrich von Lowitz decided to offer the Americans one final chance to surrender. The German commander dispatched a delegation under a white flag of truce consisting of Major Henk and First Lieutenant Helmuth Henk, accompanied by a medic and a driver. They approached the American lines near the village of Remoyfoss at approximately 11:30 in the morning, their white flag clearly visible against the snow-covered landscape. The delegation was met by First Lieutenant Leslie Smith of the 327th Glider Infantry Regiment, who blindfolded the German officers and escorted them through the American positions to the division command post. The German ultimatum was formal and precise, written in both German and English on official Wehrmacht letterhead. It demanded the surrender of the encircled American forces within 2 hours, warning that continued resistance would result in the annihilation of the defenders and the civilian population of Bastogne. The document concluded with typical German military courtesy, noting that the proposal was made to avoid unnecessary bloodshed and expressing confidence that the American commander would make the honorable decision to surrender. Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe was attending a staff meeting in a nearby building when his operations officer, Lieutenant Colonel Harry Kinnard, brought him the German ultimatum. McAuliffe read the document quickly, then looked up at his assembled staff officers with an expression of incredulous amusement. Without hesitation, he uttered what would become the most famous single word in American military history: nuts. The general staff initially thought he was simply expressing his opinion of the German proposal, but McAuliffe made it clear that this was to be his official response to the ultimatum. When Colonel Joseph Harper questioned whether such an informal reply would be understood by the Germans, McAuliffe replied that it would be perfectly clear to them. The response was typed on official division letterhead and signed by the commanding general himself. The famous nuts reply, as documented in the division's official after-action reports housed at the National Archives, became an immediate symbol of American determination and defiance in the face of overwhelming odds. When the German delegation returned under their flag of truce, they were met by Colonel Harper, who handed them the written response and began to walk away. Major Henk, clearly confused by the brevity and informality of the American reply, asked Harper to explain the meaning of the word nuts. The American colonel turned back and, with a slight smile, explained in clear terms, "It means go to hell." The German officers departed in obvious bewilderment, but there was no confusion about the American intention to continue fighting regardless of the odds. Word of McAuliffe's defiant response spread rapidly through the American lines, providing an enormous boost to morale at precisely the moment when it was needed most. The paratroopers, many of whom were down to their last few rounds of ammunition, prepared to meet the promised German assault with renewed determination. The psychological impact of the exchange extended far beyond the immediate participants. When news of the nuts response reached the outside world through our correspondence, it became an instant symbol of American courage and determination. The image of outnumbered American paratroopers refusing to surrender despite hopeless odds captured the imagination of the Allied public and provided a powerful counter-narrative to the initial shock of the German breakthrough. As December 22nd drew to a close, the defenders of Bastogne settled in for what they knew would be the most crucial night of the siege. The German ultimatum had expired, and Lowitz's forces were preparing for the final assault that would either crush American resistance or be broken against the unyielding defense of men who had chosen to fight rather than surrender. The die had been cast, and the word nuts had become the battle cry of soldiers who refused to acknowledge defeat. December 23, 1944, brought the first clear skies over the Ardennes battlefield in nearly a week, and with them came salvation from above for the besieged defenders of Bastogne. At first light, the drone of aircraft engines filled the air, as C-47 transport planes of the 9th Troop Carrier Command began dropping desperately needed supplies to the encircled American forces. Parachutes blossomed like white flowers against the gray winter sky as bundles of ammunition, medical supplies, and food drifted down toward the shrinking perimeter. The air resupply mission had been planned in desperate haste as soon as weather conditions permitted flying operations. 160 transport aircraft, escorted by fighter planes, had taken off from bases in England and France carrying 144 tons of supplies. For the Bastogne garrison, the sight of American aircraft overhead provided an enormous psychological boost to the defenders, who had felt abandoned and forgotten during the long days of the siege. Meanwhile, 60 miles to the south, Lieutenant General George Patton's Third Army was executing one of the most remarkable military maneuvers in American history. Patton had been ordered by General Omar Bradley to break off his offensive operations in the Saar region and swing his entire army 90 degrees north to relieve the pressure on the Ardennes front. The logistics of moving an entire army, over 200,000 men and thousands of vehicles, across icy roads in winter conditions, would have daunted most commanders, but Patton thrived on the impossible. The 4th Armored Division, commanded by Major General Hugh Gaffey, spearheaded Patton's relief effort as it fought its way north. Through a series of fortified German positions, the division's Combat Command B, led by Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams, had earned a reputation as one of the finest armored units in the European theater. Their Sherman tanks, upgraded with 76mm guns, punched through German defensive lines with methodical efficiency, leaving a trail of burning enemy vehicles in their wake. The German forces defending the southern approaches to Bastogne represented a mixture of elite and second-rate units, all fighting with the desperation of men who knew that failure meant the collapse of Hitler's last offensive. The 5th Parachute Division, despite its impressive designation, consisted largely of Luftwaffe ground personnel with minimal infantry training. However, they were reinforced by elements of the Panzer Lehr Division and supported by formidable anti-tank guns that turned every village into a potential fortress. According to detailed accounts preserved in the 3rd Army's operational records, Patton's forces covered over 150 miles in 72 hours, while maintaining combat effectiveness, a feat that military historians continue to study as an example of operational excellence. The fighting was particularly intense around the village of Chaumont, where German paratroopers had established a strong defensive position, blocking the main road to Bastogne. Lieutenant Colonel Abrams personally led the assault, his command tank charging through German positions while calling in artillery support by radio. The village changed hands 3 times during a single afternoon, with American and German forces engaging in house-to-house fighting that left the medieval stone buildings riddled with bullet holes and shell craters. Inside Bastogne, the situation remained critical despite the arrival of airdrop supplies. German forces had launched their most determined assault yet on December 23rd, with elements of the 26th Volksgrenadier Division penetrating the American perimeter. Near the village of Hemroul, the 327th Glider Infantry Regiment, supported by the remnants of Team Cherry's armored force, counterattacked immediately to restore the defensive line. The psychological warfare reached new levels of intensity as German loudspeakers began broadcasting surrender appeals in English, promising American prisoners good treatment and warm food. The defenders responded with characteristic American humor, shouting back various suggestions regarding what the Germans could do with their offers. The exchange became so regular that both sides began to anticipate the daily propaganda broadcasts as a form of entertainment during the siege. As December 23rd ended with the sound of Patton's guns growing steadily closer from the south, both sides prepared for what promised to be the climactic phase of the battle. The German high command knew that time was running out. If Bastogne could not be taken quickly, the entire offensive would collapse for lack of supplies and reinforcements. The race between Patton's relief column and German efforts to crush the garrison had become a deadly game of military chess, played out across the frozen landscape of the Ardennes. December 26, 1944, would be remembered as the day the tide turned decisively in favor of the Allied forces in what had become known throughout the world as the Battle of the Bulge. At 4:50 in the afternoon, 1st Lieutenant Charles Boggess of the 3rd and 7th Tank Battalion, 4th Armored Division, spotted American soldiers in foxholes ahead of his advancing Sherman tank and called out through his hatch, "Come here, this is the 4th Armored." The response from 2nd Lieutenant Webster Anderson of the 101st Airborne Division was equally emotional. "I'm damn glad to see you." The breakthrough had come after 3 days of savage fighting as Patton's spearhead battled through determined German resistance along the Ardennes-Bastogne Highway. The final German defensive line, anchored on the village of Assenois, had been held by elements of the 5th Parachute Division supported by anti-tank guns and Panzerfaust. Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams had led the final assault personally, his tank column smashing through the German positions in a classic armored charge that scattered the defenders and opened the corridor to Bastogne. The relief of Bastogne marked the beginning of the end for Hitler's Ardennes offensive, but the battle was far from over. German forces still held a dangerous salient penetrating nearly 60 miles into Allied lines, and Hitler remained convinced that victory could be achieved through continued offensive action. The Führer ordered his commanders to maintain the attack regardless of casualties. Viewing the Battle of the Bulge as Germany's last chance to avoid total defeat, however, the strategic situation had shifted irreversibly in favor of the Allies. The delay caused by the siege of Bastogne had allowed General Eisenhower to rush reinforcements to the threatened sector from across the European theater. The 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions, the 1st and 9th Armored Divisions, and elements of Patton's 3rd Army had all been committed to containing the German breakthrough. More importantly, the clear weather that had enabled the relief of Bastogne also allowed Allied air power to enter the battle decisively. The Christmas Day massacre of German armor became a preview of what awaited Wehrmacht forces as long as clear skies persisted. Rocket-firing Typhoon fighter bombers of the Royal Air Force and P-47 Thunderbolts of the United States Army Air Forces ranged freely over the battlefield, destroying German vehicles that had previously moved with impunity. Under cover of cloud and fog, the Luftwaffe, making its last significant appearance of the war, was overwhelmed by Allied numerical superiority and lost over 200 aircraft. In futile attempts to support the ground offensive, contemporary military analyses, as documented in the Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force post-battle reports, concluded that the German offensive had failed primarily due to overambitious objectives, inadequate fuel supplies, and the unexpected tenacity of American resistance at key points. The human cost of the battle was staggering for both sides. American casualties totaled over 81,000 men, including approximately 19,000 killed in action. German losses were equally severe, with an estimated 100,000 casualties and the virtual destruction of Hitler's strategic reserve. The Waffen-SS divisions that had spearheaded the offensive were reduced to skeleton units, their elite status meaningless without the men and equipment that had been squandered in the Ardennes forest. As January 1945 dawned over the battlefield, the German withdrawal accelerated into a rout as Allied forces pressed their counterattack from multiple directions. The villages and crossroads that had been household names during the December fighting, Malmedy, Saint-Vith, Houffalize, and dozens of others, were recaptured by advancing American and British forces. The bulge in Allied lines that had given the battle its popular name was systematically eliminated as German forces retreated toward the Rhine River. The Battle of the Bulge had indeed proven to be a turning point in World War II, though not in the manner Hitler had envisioned. Instead of splitting the Allied armies and forcing a negotiated peace, the German offensive had accelerated the collapse of the Third Reich. By consuming Germany's last strategic reserves in a futile gamble, the road to Berlin now lay open, and the end of the war in Europe was merely a matter of time. The young American soldiers who had stood their ground in the frozen foxholes of the Ardennes had not only saved their own army, they had helped deliver the final blow to Nazi Germany's dreams of victory.